Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll have everyone remain muted, and then participants can raise their hands, and we will choose them as they raise their hands in that order. And then anyone that doesn't want to necessarily speak or be on video can just put their question in the chat box, and then I will be able to ask it. We have Jason manning the Facebook and the YouTube live stream. And so people will also be able to put their questions in there, and he will be sending them to me, and I will be asking them if there's that much time. I fully suspect that we will pack the Zoom. There's already almost 18 people in the waiting room, and it's 7 till just pretty nuts.
Oh, no.
So
now is not your time.
Yeah. Any other questions though before we get started? How long is the presentation?
Hopefully like an hour.
Yeah.
Wow. Cool. Beautiful.
I'll just make a comment that I'm about to go ahead and start the recording. That way it's not too late. I'd rather do it too early.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Categorize. And Teri and Chris, I'm curious as to what type of contact you've had personally with the 109 team since
So 110 passed, and so was And speaking of
Thank
which,
you.
at what point, pretty soon, I want to start, or should I start live streaming to Facebook, or I should wait till we get underway a little bit? I think I can do that.
I would start as soon as possible, Kazri.
Okay. Because if I
Just
start
in case.
this will be, I just want to let people know, because we're recording this, but I'll crop all this out, you know. And then too, Jason maybe will tell us when he starts live streaming, if he probably hasn't yet, right? Yeah, soon we will open the doors and. All right.
Okay.
We're
Cool.
ready.
I am trying to find Teri's email now.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the. And just mute everyone by default. Just in case. Here we go. Thank you, Teri, for emailing me that.
Mhm.
Wow. These are beautiful bios.
And
Hello.
there's people in the waiting room.
Teri and Faye and Bob. Wow.
Whoa! Get in here!
Oh, there he goes. Okay, cool. Well, it is 7 p.m. So thanks everyone so much for being here. We're gonna wait just a couple minutes for everyone else to file in, and we will get started after. So thanks again for joining us tonight. I couldn't be more excited for this discussion. Kazri, have we successfully started the live stream?
I'm in the process.
Gotcha. Thank you, Tom. Thank you. In the meantime, I'm going to just announce some upcoming events that we have going on at the Portland Psychedelic Society for anyone interested in joining some of our following meetings. Tomorrow at 7 p.m., Casey Mitchell, our president, will be hosting the Women's Support Group, which is a safe space to discuss psychedelic experiences and curiosities for anyone who identifies as a woman. The format is open discussion on whatever topic comes up as pertinent to the attendees on the call. Thursday, November 12th, we have our art director, Nathan Cooper, facilitating the discussion on autism and psychedelics. That is a monthly meeting that we host at the Portland Psychedelic Society. Saturday, November 14th is Addiction Recovery and Psychedelics, another group hosted by our president, Casey Mitchell. Sunday, November 15th is the Psychedelic Elders Gathering. Monday, November 16th is the first day of the PPS liaison training at the Portland Psychedelic Society that will help new members be linked to more experienced psychedelic individuals within our organization. Excuse me. With the passings of measures 109 and 110, we have experienced an incredible influx of new members to our organization, and we are pretty overwhelmed with the amount of questions and requests to speak to people that can say anything about psychedelics, because a lot of people are completely clueless on the topic, which is amazing. I mean, it's a beautiful place to be as a psychedelic society here in our city, but we definitely need help. So if you feel impassioned to make those connections and draw a net around our community and help make it tighter. Please join us on November 16th for the first day of the liaison training. People in this meeting. So started here. So hi everyone, my name is Evan Segura and I am the Vice President of the Portland Psychedelic Society. If this is your first meeting, then I welcome you with open arms, as does the rest of the PPS volunteer team. The Portland Psychedelic Society is a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Portland, Oregon, dedicated to the education and research of psychedelic plant medicines. We do not condone the solicitation or selling of substances or services within our group. This is a purely educational organization, so we do ask that you don't try to ask anyone where you can find mushrooms or where you can find a guide in the chat or anything like that. As I said before, 109 just passed, so please be patient and hopefully we can change that disclaimer soon enough. But for now, we are a purely educational organization here to simply facilitate discussions and enlighten people of the wisdom of psychedelic plant medicines. So tonight, our meeting is called As Below, So Above, and we are honored to be in the presence of Dr. Chris Stauffer from OHSU here in Portland. I'm going to read a little bit about Chris, and then I'm going to read a little bit about Teri Ciacchi, who is also with us tonight. Chris Stauffer discovered MAPS, or the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, a decade ago during his psychiatry residency in San Francisco. In 2016, he was fortunate enough to be chosen as one of the 65 therapists for MAPS Phase 3 trials of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. He will also be working at the Expanded Access or Compassionate Use site here in Portland at the Somatic Center. He was also a study therapist for a psilocybin clinical trial with long-term AIDS survivors. His lab at OHSU and the Portland VA, the Social Neuroscience and Psychotherapy Lab, is in the initial phases of a trial of MDMA-assisted group therapy for veterans with PTSD, as well as psilocybin clinical research. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. All right, and I'm going to read about Reverend Teri Ciacchi now. Being Teri includes being the relational matrix of the living love revolution, being a holistic sex educator, a priestess of Aphrodite, a leader of the eco-sexuality movement, and an eco-magics practitioner. We have been generating Cascadia holistic peer counseling systems since 1997, holding Aphrodite temples since 2000, and co-created annual eco-sex events, including Surrender, the eco-sex convergence, from 2013 to 2018. In July of 2017, she started Interdependence and Autonomy LLC, a for-profit business that builds consent culture by healing conflict through education and legal advocacy. Reverend Ciacchi looks to nature for guidance and wisdom. She translates the teachings she receives from being with mycelium, bees, and stardust into usable social skills for human beings. In these unprecedented times, meaning fall 2020, she spends most of her days gardening, making herbal medicines, incenses and foods, reading, and making art. Recent collaborative efforts include forming the Quickening Collective of Ancestral Resonance and working on eco-sex articles and intermedia for public consumption.
Good job.
So, yeah, thank you again so much for joining us. It's seriously such an honor to be hosting both of you for this meeting. And with that being said, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
I'm going to start by singing a little grounding chant for you. And if you know it, you can sing along, but keep your thing muted so that you can hear it, because otherwise it just gets weird on Zoom, yeah? Ground, 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 fall back and down, down, down. into the ground, 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 where wisdom's found, found, found. We are listening into our center. We are listening into our center. We are listening into our center. Stardust inside of us blossoming. Stardust inside of us blossoming. Stardust inside of us blossoming. One heart rejoicing. One heart rejoicing. One heart rejoicing. This workshop is called As Below, So Above. Yes? I am an avatar of the dark chthonic mothers. We are midwifing the new aeon. And this time of chaos and rebirth, this is our time, the time we've waited for a very long time. The Living Love Revolution is a culture making organization where the culture we make has love as a central embodied ethic. Mycelium, bees, and stardust are the inner mysteries of the Living Love Revolution. And we say crazy things like network like mycelium, cross-pollinate like bees, illuminate like stardust. I'm staying awake with you, eternal. So our thinking that a culture that would be a culture worth living into would build bioregional subcultures that are simultaneously different from and in allyship with each other. So the Living Love Revolution is only one of multitudes of possible, imaginative examples of how queer magical practitioners can center their magic and their lives around their own values. Creating our own countercultures is revolutionary praxis and can be more empowering and pleasurable than resisting the fading Uber culture. The fading Uber culture is a term I made up for the culture I was born into that doesn't meet my own needs. So my work as a Living Love Revolution Aphrodite priestess and temple hierophant is my great work. It's unfinished, but a steadily building artistic communal masterpiece of transpersonal love and social transformation. The system we've designed and co-created with many people over the last 30 years is producing 3 to 4 weekend-long Aphrodite temple retreats per year. And those also have advanced temples. And those advanced temples include entheogen use. We favor psilocybin as our entheogen of choice. I also started out in my 20s as a psychiatric social worker. I got an MSW in psychiatric social work in 1988. And I practiced from 1988 to 1998 as a social worker in different nonprofits. And I did things like I was the executive director of a group home called the William Ware Residence in Eugene. And I worked in community mental health. And then I went to private practice in 1997. And I started creating this temple system in 2005. I've had 5 different ordinations. I did some graduate study in eco-psychology at Lewis and Clark in 2014. I've done the Zendo training, but I've mostly invented my own systems. That's all I'm going to say about myself and my work. And now it's time for Chris to say something.
So, and just to clarify from my poorly written bio, I didn't discover maps, but I myself discovered this thing that already existed for many decades before. But I will talk later about maps and its role in all of this. But I'm coming from this from a slightly different angle, but I think something that I hope that Teri and I can show is that there's not, a lot of these boundaries are very artificial. And so to just kind of set the stage for this presentation, Teri and I first met at the Queering Psychedelics conference in San Francisco in the summer of 2019. And I felt immediately drawn to you. And we had only we'd only met a couple of times at conferences before we decided to do this talk together. And it's been
Right.
such a pleasure, putting this together and getting to know you better. And I feel like I could listen to your encyclopedic knowledge about beautiful things and your life's philosophies for, days on end. So it's been, a real pleasure. And I think the seed of this talk came from the Queering Psychedelics conference. We were in the same breakout group and we were discussing psychedelic therapy. And I think you made some comments about, if you're getting psychedelic therapy, you don't want to be in a clinic with fluorescent lighting, and you want your therapist to be able to touch you.
Bad music.
Yeah. And so
bad music.
And I just took kind of note in my mind that some of those things, we do. It is part of our training, but it's not necessarily widely known. And in my mind, I didn't say anything to you that day, but it felt like there was sort of inevitable tension with integrating what had become the above ground work and what was the below ground work. And it seemed like a great opportunity for bridge building. And so thinking about the spectrum from, ancient indigenous psychedelic practices to corporate psychopharmacology and government regulatory bodies, I feel like Teri and I lie somewhere in between. And it's important for our efforts to align because we're ultimately working toward the same goal, which is to bring healing to people who need it. And so to be very clear about this presentation, we don't claim to have any answers. We mostly just hope to explore, the space between the underground and above ground psychedelic practitioners and essentially start a discussion and a dialogue. And so we can share vital knowledge and kind of go from there.
Mm-hmm. So one of the first things that we need to do, at least from one of my magical traditions, the reclaiming tradition, we do land acknowledgements. And first off, I just want to say it's really not enough for me as a person who is identified as white, read as white, who has white privilege and access to white power, to just say, okay, I'm going to acknowledge that I'm on indigenous unceded territory. So I know that is not enough, but I also feel like it's something. It is at least a beginning, okay? So I want to just acknowledge that Portland rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, the Catholinet, the Clackamas, the Chinook, the Tualatin, the Kalapuya, the Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. And I want to encourage you to look up oneskycenter.org and to contribute to organizations like the Indigenous Environmental Network. And if you're involved in psychedelics, to get involved with the Chacruna organization that held the Queering Psychedelics Conference. We just want to take a moment to pay our respect to elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land throughout generations and whose cultures make it possible for us to now have this psychedelic renaissance in mainstream culture. Blessed be.
And it just so happens that Chacruna, so Bia Labache, the founder and director of Chacruna, released this article today called Psychedelic Scientists Should Honor Indigenous Plants and Traditions. And so it's another sort of bridge building moment for the psychedelic community. And just to, read a quote, I encourage you to go to the Chacruna website and read the article. All of their articles are up for free. But this quote, I like, what does this mean to claim to that psychedelic scientists should create bridges with indigenous ceremonial uses and traditions? It does not mean that we should abandon science or deny it. We should question the privileged position of science, take indigenous knowledge equally seriously, and stop considering it symbolic or subjective versus the objective and factual science. If our clinical approaches truly dialogue and collaborate with native practices, revolutionary creative possibilities might arise. And I feel the same thing about, what was previously considered underground work and above ground work. And then I find this from Mad Thoughts on Mushrooms, this sort of categorization to be helpful in these discussions because it's so difficult to talk across these different categories. And a lot of times people are, their lens is from two separate categories, and they're trying to talk as if they're the same thing, and often they're not. And so different categories that society can look at psychedelics through, toxological, or poison, which pathologizes. It's a reaction to our body's reaction to a toxic substance, and it can mimic psychosis or hallucinations. That was kind of earlier thoughts about psychedelics. And then prohibition is more of a political and societal way of looking at it, and it creates criminals and threatens the public, and so that's another lens that psychedelics have been looked at through for a long time. Recreational, fun, enjoyment, supports hedonic freedom. Psychedelics as psychedelic. So psychedelic means mind manifesting, or self-exploration. Can facilitate creativity and insight. Bob Jesse talks about the betterment of well people. And then psychological, or using it as medicine or for healing, psychological healing. And then entheogenic discourse is using it as a sacrament or a religion, often to, so entheogenic is eliciting the divine within, and so the God within. And then animistic is speaking to the gods without. And so a lot of indigenous cultures have used psychedelics in this way. The belief that everything is conscious and everything has a soul, and you can commune with different plant spirits. And so it's, I think, important to acknowledge these different categories, and then also, acknowledge that these boundaries are very blurry. For many, recreational or sacramental use is also therapeutic and healing. It's important not to pathologize recreational use. It's just a different thing from, sacramental or medical use.
Okay, the next set of slides are going to be about the set and setting, creating the space for psilocybin sessions, entheogen use sessions. As I hinted at in my introduction, my work is to create spaces for consciousness sovereignty and embodied liberation. And there are three basic settings in terms of what the actual physical environment that we offer are for our experiences. One is for temple spaces for small group encounters of 15 to 25 people. One are for one-on-one sessions, and one are for getting into the outdoors for large rituals at festivals or advanced temples. So we're going to just show you a few of the actual spaces that we've created, with the understanding that you need to have specific attention to set and settings in order to help people have mystical experiences. Yep. So these are some of the examples of temple spaces that we've created. You can just go ahead. That's a beautiful altar. We like that. And then we're going to show you some of the indoor session spaces that we've used. Pretty comfortable. And then my favorite is, which is part of like my whole ecosexual thing, to be outdoors and to have nature be a place of communion. One of my favorite places to take people is the whole rainforest, because my understanding is that the mycelial mat that's there is one of the thickest on the planet. And this is a beautiful space we used on Orcas Island. It was really like you could feel things coming in and out of that tree's being. It was just very helpful. And then we like to do a format with small groups where we do the entheogen the night of, and we have people be in silence from 10 or 11 at night through breakfast. We get together, have breakfast, and then we co-create a ritual based on our experiences together. And this is some photographic documentation of one that we did in 2018. It's also really important to do this thing. Let's see. I'm a little nervous, so I'll take a breath. I feel like it's really important to be right-sized And I want to say what that means and why I think ritual is essential to creating a set and setting that prepares someone for a mystical experience. I've taken the phrase right size from my peer and teacher, Rain Crow. In the Living Love Revolution, being right sized means focusing on the larger than human world and our interdependent place in the web of all life. So we think it's important that we remember and then take ritual actions that embody our appropriately embedded selves. And that if we do that, if we do this ritual setup, then we kind of dial ourselves into the middle of a hologram that's already connected to many other things that aren't human. And that helps us be less likely to abuse power because we're decentering humans and we're recentering the entire web. And we're thinking constellationally, which is one of the ways that we are like mycelium and bees and stardust. When we think about ourselves as a we, as a unit that's embedded in a web of life, we're less likely to abuse our power. So that's one reason to do it. Next. Some of the ritual components that are important in helping us become right-sized are things that I researched and then got initiated in because I knew that there were pre-Christian, European, indigenous structures and religions, and I bothered to seek those out and get initiated and find elders and spend a lot of time doing that. So the ritual components are energetically as important as the beauty of the physical environment in creating a harmonious set and setting. We use magic and ritual to create structures that put humans inside of a 7-directional hologram, east, south, west, and north, as well as above, below, and within. We also do groundings, making sure that we're connecting the below to the above to form a vertical line energetically through our bodies. And then we create a cross by connecting a horizontal line of heart resonance and making it go out the channel of our hands to connect with those around us, humans and non-humans. We call that creating a cross. And then we create a 3-dimensional sphere of protection in a circle. You can read instructions for how to do this on the Living Love Revolution website in the essay that's there called The Line, the Cross, and the Circle, How Magic Begins. It's also helpful to understand what a toroid is because that's one of the things that we create energetically to raise energy through. Next slide. Energetic understandings of Western mystery schools are also relevant. In the hidden religions of Western Eurocentric magics that I'm an initiate of, ritual space relies on 7 energetic understandings, right? So we said 5 elements: air, fire, water, earth, and spirit or essence. 4 cardinal directions: east, south, west, north, and again 3 realms: above, below, and center. Next. Another important part of creating ritual context for the set and setting is having an intention. Intentions are essential to all magic, and I think therefore they're essential to all ritual contexts. And they're a helpful addition to the therapeutic use of entheogens. So it's really useful to ask the people that are working with you to prepare themselves by coming up with an intention for their session. This is an example of an intention that we created for an event that we were going to have at summer solstice this year. We awaken to our interconnectedness with the earth and all beings in sacred relationship. So that's a good example of an intention. Next. It's also really important to have clear processes so that you can facilitate informed consent with people. Whatever your structure for a small ritual or a whole weekend event, like the Aphrodite temple, it's important to be clear about the structure, to have it transparently provided, to clearly articulate each step, to have that openly displayed. It allows people to have informed consent, again, so that everyone present knows all the steps of the process and no one is surprised by what's going to happen. Okay, and then we just have some beautiful, the next picture is the main altar from the January 2020 mycelial temple with all the mushrooms that we then cut up and ate all weekend. They were beautiful. And the next photo is just an example of magical tools that you'd probably have present if you're doing this kind of ritual. And then we have a picture of me being a bee. Isn't that fun? The altar and high priestess from the 2015 Hive Heart Temple. It's important to provide a sacred environment which brings pleasure to the senses and is part of facilitating a mystical experience for the participants. Next. It's also really important to embody and understand how to be in a therapeutic role. So it's the witness facilitator's job to be able to adopt an attitude of unconditional loving kindness. And I can tell you, because I did bother to get a master's in social work, getting an education does not always mean that you're going to be able to embody loving kindness. That's something that I found easier to learn in the underground or in alternative non-academic spaces. So I love Dan Siegel's work, his interpersonal neurobiology work, and he talks about adopting the attitude of COLE, the acronym COLE, which stands for being curious, open, accepting, and loving. And so in the temples and the sessions that I do with people, I actually say this. I say a little declaration that includes all of you is welcome here. Everything that you like about yourself and the things you don't like about yourself. Your shadow is welcome here, as well as your light. And I make sure that people actually experience the sense of love and warmth and acceptance that I feel. And I feel that that's a part of our main job, is to be able to bring that to sessions. Okay. And then we have one more picture, which is me anchoring. In this picture, I'm role modeling the embodiment of transpersonal love, which is what I teach people in the priestess training, for them to become a role model of transpersonal love for their communities as a resource. So here you can see that the dress and the aesthetic match the stated theme of the session or event, because this is a temple of roses. And this is a photograph that's been taken after I have invoked Aphrodite. And so it represents me in a transpersonal context where I'm both anchoring the entire group energetically, running golden light through the room, being an avatar of the deity Aphrodite, and leading programming. So this is just a small example of one of the ways you can do things that we wanted to bring you today. And now I'm going to turn this over to Chris for a while.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of these organizations and the roles that they have played. But before I do that, just, you know, talking about sort of the grand history. So from my perspective, our relationships with plant medicines have been evolving long before recorded history. And the first war on drugs started with the Catholic Church, with, you know, pushing psychedelic practices underground hundreds of years ago in many different parts of the world. And psychedelics emerged in modern Western society in the 40s with LSD, in the late 50s with psilocybin. And from 1950 to the mid 60s, there were more than 1,000 clinical papers published about the sessions of an estimated 40,000 patients. There were books written about psychedelic therapy, and there were 6 international conferences prior to the mid 60s on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And then, as many of you know, in 1970, with the Controlled Substances Act, came the second war on drugs, and psychedelic healing was again pushed underground. And then MDMA briefly popped up in the 70s, but was also made illegal in 1985. And these things prior to this were used as part of therapy legally. And when these went underground, underground practitioners carried the thread for several decades. However, I mean, and Teri, tell me if you have anything to add, but there was no safe venue for standardization of practices or any open sort of sharing of therapeutic techniques or ethical guidelines. So the underground diversified, and yet it persisted. And now we're here again, feeling the tensions of mainstreaming something sacred into a capitalistic society with a medical industrial complex. And so I think anyone who's been part of a marginalized group will understand both the pros and the cons of assimilation into a wider culture. And so wider acceptance means, you know, the ability to be more safely oneself in a larger amount of settings, while at the same time, there's really a feeling of a loss of community and maybe even a loss of purpose if you were really tied to that identity. So that being said, 1985, when MAPS was made into a DEA Schedule 1 substance, which Schedule 1 substance means that it has no recognized medical use. It's not safe to administer even in a medical setting, and it has a high potential for abuse. And so for a lot of these substances, it blocked research funding coming from government agencies and really delayed research starting back up. But the year after MDMA became a Schedule 1 substance, Rick Doblin founded MAPS, or the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And the goal of MAPS has been to act as a drug development company for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, going through the proper procedure leading up to FDA approval. And then the Council on Spiritual Practices was founded by Bob Jesse in 1994. The Hefter Research Institute was founded in 1993. And the Beckley Foundation was founded in 1998 by Amanda Fielding. And these organizations have funded most of the Post-Controlled Substances Act psilocybin research. And the average cost of bringing a new drug through the FDA drug development process is estimated to be $2 to $3 billion. And so usually only big pharma has these kinds of funds. The pharmaceutical industry has not developed MDMA or psilocybin, presumably for a couple of reasons. They're off patent, and you can't patent psilocybin mushrooms. They're only administered at most a few times during a course of treatment rather than daily or multiple times daily, like many psychopharmaceutical agents. And then to be administered safely and effectively, they require a lot of therapy hours. So it just didn't seem like a good investment to big pharma. So MAPS has essentially functioned as a nonprofit drug development company for MDMA therapy, and has raised over $100 million since 1986. Not investments, all private donations. And then as they're nearing FDA approval, so they're in the final phase of research prior to the FDA having to decide whether or not this will be an FDA approved medication. And I guess medication psychotherapy combination, which is new for the FDA. But the IRS won't allow a nonprofit to sell a pharmaceutical product. So MAPS has formed the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. And the plan is for all of the profits from MDMA to go back into MAPS and fund additional research. And then the USONA Institute, which was started in 2014, is now acting as a nonprofit drug development company for psilocybin therapy. And as for-profit psychedelic corporations have been popping up, both MAPS and USONA stand for open science, transparency, and collaboration, which I think is really important and a value that really comes from this work itself. So this is the structure of the treatment for MAPS for their phase 3 clinical trials. There are 3 preparatory sessions. Those are 90-minute non-drug sessions to prepare the individual for how to work with MDMA and build rapport with the therapists. And then there are 3 experimental sessions. Some of the earlier studies had only 2 experimental sessions, and those are each about a month apart. And those are day-long medicine sessions. And those are each followed by 3 90-minute integration sessions, each about a week apart. And this is our treatment room that we set up at UCSF. So you can see it's not different. Yeah, it's not that much different. It's not, you know, this was in the middle of the hospital. So people had to walk through that setting to get here, but we tried to create a little womb that was, you know, different than what you might expect. And then the therapeutic approach. So MAPS has published this manual online, and this is the manual that they use to train providers to conduct this work. And I think that's a great service to the community to just provide this open source. And it's very helpful. So essentially, let me see if I can find my notes here. So part of the preparation is, in this work, we try to create a unique space for each individual. And so we ask them, you know, what their spiritual practice is. And the goal is to make it as comfortable an environment for someone who's an atheist or someone who's a Buddhist or someone who's a Christian, and allow them to sort of bring their own symbology into the space. We ask them about preferences for, or sensitivities to smells, light, touch, music. There was music throughout, and we encourage, it's an inner-directed approach. So during the medicine sessions, we try as much as possible to get them to go inward and work with their own content that's coming up, and then use the therapist if they need. And there are 2 co-therapists. Initially, it was male-female pairs, but that's not the case anymore, which is good. And then in the preparatory sessions, we help the individual come up with an intention without expectation. And so they have an intention going in, but no expectations about how that will be met. And they go into each session with a beginner's mind, and we trust in the innate healing capacity of the individual. And so everybody's trauma is individual, everybody's healing process is individual, and only they know best what they need to heal. And so there's not a lot of guidance. And so there's been a lot of back and forth of what even to call these therapists. And then we honor defenses. And so it's interesting, Teri mentioned all parts are welcome is something that we say. It's from internal family systems. We say all parts are welcome, and we if shame's coming up or fear's coming up, we ask the participant to move into those things and eventually move through them. And if body feelings are coming up, then we have a protocol to kind of go through that. And so first we will have them direct their breath to whatever sensations coming up in their body. And ultimately we are, have a protocol where we can provide counter pressure. And so there is touch and a protocol for sort of safe somatic work. And let's see. So this is the therapy training program that I went through before I started in phase 3. There's an online course, it's about 14 hours, and then a 7-day, used to be in-person retreat, but now they're doing it virtually. And then experiential learning. So this can be something like holotropic breath work or internal family systems workshop, something where you're learning a new skill that complements this type of treatment. Another option, this is not a mandated part of the training, but it's an option. There's an FDA approved trial for therapists to receive this treatment. And so to get an MDMA therapy session from 2 of the mentors from the program. And I'll show you some pictures. I actually went through that, I think January of 2018. And it was a mind-blowing session. And then once you've gone through parts A through C, you have to be part of a team. And so because we can't use this legally, it has to be in the context of an FDA approved clinical trial. And then you do a recorded practice session, and then you have your first case supervised very closely, where the supervisor watches all the videos and provides feedback. And let me see. So this was our team in the Bay Area. There were 12 of us. And I was one of the younger. We spanned in age, I think at the time, this was 2016. We spanned from mid to late 30s all the way up into 70s, and everything in between. So it was a group that was diverse in age, but you can see we're all, pretty white appearing people. So that's something that MAPS has been working on, is increasing the diversity of the therapists. We learned from Marcella and Bruce and Michael and Annie. And then Michael and Annie learned, from Stan and Christina Groff, who developed LSD psychotherapy back in the 50s and 60s. And then when LSD became illegal to work with, they developed holotropic breath work, which was a way to access non-ordinary states of consciousness, just using breath and music and intention. So I think it's important, like Teri said, to know your lineage, and that goes in both directions. So this is this is from my session with Bruce and Marcella, and I just wanted to show this because I couldn't, you can't show videos or pictures from patient sessions, but there was a lot of somatic work, and I think this is right before I was about to throw up, and Marcella wanted me to throw up in her 200-year-old Tibetan singing bowl, and I said no way. But just to show you that it's really not that different. And there was a point where Bruce went to let the dogs out, and I asked him if he would bring them back so I could see them, little emotional support animals. Let's see.
We're going to talk about what a temporary autonomous zone is. I loved looking at the pictures of you in your session, though. So a temporary autonomous zone is described by Hakim Bey as a mobile or transient location free of economic and social interference by the state. So he wrote a book in 1985 called Temporary Autonomous Zone, Ontological Anarchy and Poetic Terrorism. And this idea is really important because it basically argues for the idea that we can get together collectively and produce temporary autonomous zones where we have the ability to exert our own autonomy in the present moment. And that we can do this, we can create the world that we want to have by suspending the default group norms and creating our own group norms and consenting to it as a collective. And then we don't have to accept the domination of the culture that we were born into. We can have this bookmarked time where we do what we want. And that having temporary autonomous zones, and the idea of temporary autonomous zones, is a main idea behind festivals such as Burning Man, right? And it's also the idea that I've taken up that allows me to move towards unitary consciousness and create events that have love as a central ethic inside of a culture that actually has money as a central ethic, right? So in a way, creating events and even doing one-on-one sessions with entheogens and psilocybin specifically allows us to dissolve all kinds of artificial categories and boundaries that we are socialized into, right? Because just for a moment, one of the magical things that happened is that Chris Stauffer and I decided to do this presentation more than 3 weeks ago. And since then, psilocybin has become legal for therapeutic use. And 2 years from now, we'll be legally practicing that. And also all drugs have been decriminalized, right? So that's something that happened that we caused to happen if you're a voter and you voted for that, right? So it's useful to be really intentional and go, okay, I'm going to approach all of this. And anytime people get together and decide that they're going to create something visionary, it's an act of magic, right? Because we're like, oh, what do we want to do? We want to create this time and space where we can have absolute freedom inside of a consent container, right? So that's just an important part of what we're doing, is declaring temporary autonomous zones. Next slide. So we want to move towards unitary consciousness and dissolve artificial categories and boundaries between the above ground and the below ground as well. So my question then is, are all entheogen sessions temporary autonomous zones of social experimentation and consciousness sovereignty? It can be useful to consider that they are, and that we're purposefully offering experiments in consciousness sovereignty for declared specific periods of time. We just suspend the normative, mundane group consensus reality of the fading Uber culture and enter the magical realm of all possibilities. And then we decide what our intentions are. And based on what our intention is, we express trust in the unfolding, deconstructing of the self and the dissolution into unity consciousness. And intentionally, we enter non-dual realms where we then can reemerge and integrate in a way that allows for the arising of the big S self-healing. In other words, we're trusting that the universe and all the beings in it have a movement towards self-health, holistic well-being, and evolution, right? And that if we approach a space with the right loving attitude of witnessing and dissolve the self, it'll reconstitute and be more whole. Stop. And now I'm going to say, it's up to you, Chris, to talk about the potential risks.
So my colleagues at work, I mean, this is the first thing that they ask when they hear that I'm involved in this research and they hear about Measure 109. What are the risks? You know, there's not enough data on the risks. I mean, what we do know is, particularly with MDMA, but also with our work with psilocybin, we see heightened physiology, so increase in blood pressure, increase in heart rate. And so for people with cardiovascular risk or neurovascular risk, we would want to screen them out. We also see an increase in neural activity, and so we want to be careful with people with seizure disorders. That being said, when you look at the CDC website and the DEA website, when they report overdose deaths for opioids or benzodiazepines or stimulants, which are all things that I can legally prescribe, there are no reported overdose deaths for these substances. There are, I think that's just, I'll stop there before I go off on another tangent. So there's physical risks, and then interpersonal sort of psychological risks. People talk a lot about a bad trip. I think that's sort of the shadow of expanded consciousness, is maybe there are things that you have relegated to your unconscious for a reason. And if you're not in the proper set and setting and you don't have the proper integration, a bad trip can be re-traumatizing for somebody. And there may be, an increase in subsequent suicidality, and you may uncover a psychiatric disorder like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia spectrum illness. And then there's behavioral risks, and this is what they, I think, would tell people in the 70s, is that you would, think you could fly and go jump off of a roof or something, which I don't think was a major issue, but there are real risks to a default world set and setting when in a non-ordinary state of consciousness. So that's why set and setting is so important. And so when colleagues at the hospital ask me about the risks, these are the things that they think of. For me, these are not the risks I'm most concerned about. We have pretty good screening protocols to prevent medical and psychological harm when administering these substances. We have the skills as therapists to turn a bad trip into a healing opportunity. But it's the interpersonal risks that I find the most dangerous.
That's right.
Yeah, so combining an imbalance of power with vulnerable individuals and vulnerable states of consciousness with substances that enhance interpersonal bonding, and that's fertile ground for abuses of power. And so we also think about things like systemic racism and psychedelic exceptionalism, preventing access to marginalized communities who may find the most benefit from these treatments. And so Julie Holland talks about the importance of ethical guidelines in order to protect patients, protect therapists, and protect the entire field, which is vulnerable within the larger framework of medicine. And so one ethical consideration has been referred to as the overbonding problem or boundary transgressions. And this has already occurred in above ground work that is highly monitored and highly scrutinized. And so it's important to talk about. It's important to also talk about that boundary violations are often not motivated or conscious, and they can still be very harmful. And so I think about the sorcerer's apprentice, unleashing something and not maybe being fully aware of the power. So proper training, proper consent, proper oversight, and open discussions in above ground settings can actually greatly reduce the risks involved in these treatments from this perspective. A number two ethical consideration goes along with accessibility. Because of imbalance in punishment with war on drugs, a lot of marginalized populations don't find their way to the underground. We also have seen that they haven't found their way to clinical trials either. And so there have been efforts to improve the diversity of clinical trial participants. Number three, ethical consideration is kind of across the field. I think it's important in psychedelic science to value collaboration over competition, transparency, data sharing, anti-competitive practices. And a lot of the organizations that I've mentioned are doing that. And so it'll be important to implement an ethical framework in order to maximize the benefits and minimize the harm. And it's important for us to remember that we don't need to start completely from scratch. And so Alicia Danforth, in a recent article, I think she's one of the great modern psychedelic ethicists, in my opinion. She says we can look at other professional safeguards in place for providers of vulnerable populations. So like pediatrics, geriatrics, anesthesiology. And then we can also look at underground organizations that out of necessity have developed extensive ethical guidelines and practices to protect vulnerable individuals from harm. And so now just to sort of jump to certification and licensure. So part of Measure 109 is, to the psilocybin advisory board will advise the Oregon Health Authority on what the licensing requirements are for facilitators of psilocybin services. And so these are not all of them, but it's just a couple. Must submit evidence of completion of education and training, prescribed and approved by the Oregon Health Authority, must have passed an exam, must have a high school diploma or equivalent education. And so I think this is an important one. And then the authority may not require a psilocybin service facilitator to have a degree from a university, college, post-secondary institution, or other institution of higher education. And I think Teri's right. I mean, you can get all the letters after your name that you want and all the training and degrees within our sort of broken healthcare system. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a good healer. And so I think it's an interesting thing to think about. This is a quote from 1960. So this is from, I think, from a psychedelic psychotherapy conference. So is LSD a therapy in itself with the therapeutic relationship functioning merely for support? Or is the essential therapeutic process the sort of thing in which the therapeutic relationship is the essence of the therapy and LSD simply facilitates or catalyzes it? And this was 60 years ago, and there's still really no great empirical evidence to answer this question. And so the current treatment approach really emphasizes the importance of medicine, set, and setting, and set being the mindsets of the therapist and the participant. So for the first time since the 1960s, therapists have started to reconvene to discuss not just whether psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy works and looking at clinical outcomes of clinical trials, but talking about how it works, to share with other therapists which qualities of a guide or a healer or a facilitator, and which techniques lead to the best outcomes. So this is from an article written by Janice Phelps, and she's the director of the Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research at the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is right now, I think, the most prominent above ground certificate program for psychedelic therapists. So let's just go through these quickly. One, empathetic abiding presence. And so that's it's kind of come through the research, and I'm sure the underground as well, that mindful listening with empathy and presence is thought to be more impactful than engaging in dialogue or inquiry. And when I was learning this method, I mean, that was one of the most challenging things, was forgetting things, unlearning things that I had learned in my Western medical training. And one of the acronyms we use is WAIT, which is why am I talking? And then two is trust enhancement. So trust within the therapeutic alliance, trust in the medicine, and most importantly, trust in the patient's own inner healing intelligence, and that what is coming up during a session is coming up for healing, even if it's what we, might not expect. Spiritual intelligence. So at the very least, Janice says the therapist should have an understanding of transpersonal psychology and mystical experiences. Roland Griffith's team at Johns Hopkins developed the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. So this is now science, which has been significantly correlated with the therapeutic outcomes from psilocybin therapy studies. Knowledge of the physical and psychological effects of psychedelics. So in addition to knowledge of best practices for psychedelic therapy, things like screening, contraindications, informed consent, how to create a set and setting. Expertise in this area can also range from the therapeutic application of the anthropology of shamanism, knowledge of ethnobotany or plant medicines, and skillful, artful inclusion of ceremonial aspects of healing within community. And that's a quote from Janice's paper. Therapist self-awareness and ethical integrity. So this is probably the most abstract, but I think the most insidiously enacted of these competencies. And this is composed of 6 components: self-awareness of personal motives for this work, integrity in protecting boundaries with the volunteers or the participants, well-developed capacities for building therapeutic alliances, skills in attachment theory and transference countertransference analysis. So learning to not directly enact roles in response to the participants' unconscious material during sessions is a key skill. And finally, the personal self-care, or doing one's own work, so to speak. So, you know, whatever you need to do, whether it's therapy or meditation or your own sort of psychedelic practice, so that you can be present for the individual and not get too tangled up in your own stuff as it's coming up. And then the last is proficiency in complementary techniques. And so this is mainly used during prep and integration, but some skills can transfer to the medicine session as well. And this includes, you know, mindfulness and breathing techniques, internal family systems, which I mentioned earlier, holotropic breath work, somatic experiencing, Hakomi. And a lot of these things, you don't need to be licensed as a therapist to get certified in. And these are all great techniques. And then this is just to kind of show some of the trainings that are currently available for psychedelic therapists. CIIS is the largest one. They expanded their program. So now they'll have a program in San Francisco and then a Boston cohort as well this next year, although they had to do this entire year virtually because of COVID. This highlights the importance of including elders as part of training. So the CIIS program, psychedelic therapy training and psychedelic support, which is the bottom left, all have included psychedelic elders in their training, and not just scientists either. And then we have the Zendo project, which is psychedelic peer support or a harm reduction model. And this opens the question, you know, what sort of traditional licensure should be required? And with the expanded access program, so I'm working with the Somatic Center here in Portland on the expanded access or compassionate use of MDMA assisted therapy, where people will have the ability to undergo the treatment outside of a clinical trial before it's FDA approved. And the FDA decided that one member of the co-therapy pair had to have an MD or a PhD for expanded access, but we're hoping that requirement doesn't stick once they, you know, see how it goes with expanded access. And then Fluence, started by Elizabeth Nielsen and Ingmar Gorman in New York, as certification in psychedelic integration, but they also work with ketamine assisted psychotherapy. And so there are a lot of, seems like everywhere there are ketamine assisted psychotherapy training programs popping up. And then one of those, the psychedelic therapy training with Psychedelic Somatic Institute. So that was also started by one of the phase 3 or phase 2 MAPS therapists, and they're going to have a training in Portland in January. So.
Wow, that's so much,
Yeah,
right?
that's a lot.
That's great. So I wrote down the trainings, protocols, and ethical guidelines that we have created through Living Love Revolution over the last 20 years. And the one that's the most useful, I think, is called the Safer, Braver Space Protocol. And then we do anchor training. We have this little like book. It's all like this energetic work of being grounded, how to ground yourself, and then how to ground a room, and how to ground a group, and how to ground a ritual. It just kind of goes out in concentric circles. We also just teach people how to create screening questions, how to design clear intentions, how to, in a group dynamic process, how to have clearly stated boundaries that keep people safe. We also have different mediation processes. We teach Cascadia holistic peer counseling so that people can both practice that loving attention that is space holding rather than getting into people's space and interfering in a way. And then we have a lot of really clear definitions of consent and protocols. So all of that stuff, if you're not someone that wants to work with me personally in a mystical way and join the Aphrodite Temple Priestess body, I also have now a nonprofit, I'm sorry, it's not right, an LLC called Interdependence and Autonomy, where I can meet with people and share all these documents and try to do a consult where I help you design your own documents if you're going to create a training system or something like that. Well, this is just all to say these things have been going on for a long time, but now I get to like talk about it in public without being frightened, which is kind of fun. And our timing has been pretty good.
Yeah.
So that's what we have there. And now I'm going to have a mycelial temple. It looks like it's right on top of that psychedelic support training that you just talked about, which I'm going to go and find out about those people. This is how you would contact me or how you would contact Chris. And we're going to say, thank you so much for coming to this presentation. We're really excited to have some time. I think we have almost half an hour for Q&A. Is that correct? That
is correct. Yeah, and thank you both. Thank you both so much. That was absolutely incredible. So as Teri said, we are now going to transition into a discussion where anyone in the audience can feel free to ask any questions to the presenters, and Jason will be sending me the questions from the live streams happening elsewhere in the internet dimensions. And if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, Teri, go ahead.
Take down the slideshow so that we could see people.
Yeah, totally.
Awesome. And Chris, somebody put a question, Alicia put a question in the thing, which is one that came up when you and I were talking, which is there a requirement that people have experience with psilocybin? And I know that you and I immediately got into this long conversation about that, because one of the things that I really appreciate is the mental health systems that have come from people like Marsha Linehan, who, after she developed a successful group therapy for people with borderline diagnosis, which is now called dialectical behavior therapy and is like the standard for how to deal with something that I was taught in my training in the 80s. You know, this horrible attitude in the 80s was that people with a borderline diagnosis are like, just stay away from them. Don't work with them. They're dangerous. They'll destroy you personally. I'm like, really? This is what you're teaching us in the field of mental health in a master's? Okay. But, you know, that she designed her own system and then didn't come out and say that she had a diagnosis until it was successful. Yeah. And then also Pat Deegan, who started the whole recovery model as someone who was an addict, and then, right? So that, I think personally, people who haven't done psilocybin should not be facilitating psilocybin sessions. But how do you make that a requirement when it's been illegal? So what do you have to say about that, Chris?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think, one thing that I hear people say a lot is that there's a lot of different ways to get to the same space. I know that, you know, meditation work, it can take years to sort of get to the same space as a psilocybin session. Mm-hmm. But holotropic breath work is a nice way to sort of get into this space without this. But I agree, there is an aspect of it that if you don't know the landscape, I don't know if I would want to go to a psychedelic therapist who had never done psychedelics.
Yeah, and that was one of my primary critiques of the CIIS. Is like, for me, I'm 58 years old. I'm not necessarily going to want to sit with someone who's in their 20s who's never done the drug. I just don't. It doesn't engender trust and reciprocity in me.
Mhm.
But you know,
And that being said, I think too that there's a spectrum of sort of like, if you're treating someone with severe mental illness, you know, maybe you should definitely have experience and you should definitely have training as a therapist as well. But if you're sort of working with somebody to just have their own experience, I mean, it helps, I think, if you have training as a therapist, but I don't think you necessarily need it. But even in that instance, I think, you know, you're going to be helped more by somebody who understands the experience itself. Let's see. Looking at some of these questions as well.
there's some stuff.
But if you're sort of working with somebody,
I can read the
who
next
just have their
question
own
from Drew Johnston here.
Thank you, Evan.
And it is directed towards Chris. Drew says, you mentioned the requirement of having both a man and a woman present for MDMA therapy wasn't a good thing. Perhaps the words were mixed up there, but why would you not want to have both present?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that, I mean, that was the original model, and that's what came out of Stan and Christina Groff's work from early on with LSD. And the initial thought was you have, you know, a mother figure and a father figure, and for, you know, the participant to project their transferences onto and to have those different energies. And, you know, then that was taught to Michael and Annie Mithofer, who were a married couple, and then Marcella and Bruce, who were a married couple. And that was what was taught to our group. But our group was, you know, not only diverse in sexual orientation, but also gender. And, you know, for somebody who identifies as non-binary, what does that mean? Do they have a mom and a dad and a non-binary authority figure? And so Jay Sebelius, and I'll write it in the chat, wrote a nice article for Shakruna, just kind of picking this apart and thinking about, you know, does it really need to be a male and a female? And in doing the work, I had a couple different co-therapists in the studies, and it wasn't always the case that, I mean, I'm not the most masculine of people, but it wasn't always the case that I was, you know, projected the father stuff and my female co-therapist was projected the mother stuff. And so our team at San Francisco, I'm pretty sure had the first male-male co-therapy team in the MAPS phase 3 study. And I know that the couples therapy study that MAPS did had the first female-female co-therapy teams, but we also had a female-female co-therapy team at our site. And it'll be interesting to look at the data, but I don't think it's at least now in this day and age, essential that it be a male and a female.
Because basically that like assumes a heteronormative dyad is normal and anything else is abnormal or derivative, and it also centers straightness in a way that's alienating to people like me who are queer, or people who grew up with a single mom or something like that. So we want to be really careful when we're creating standards to make them inclusive, because one of the problems we have now is that even though the use for thousands of years of entheogens and plant medicines came out of indigenous cultures and Black cultures, Black and indigenous people are not benefiting from the legalization of it in the same proportion. There was a really great article, I don't know if you sent this to me, Chris, but I read it today, that was published, oh geez, am I gonna misquote it? By Jamila, it was a Whitney Joyner in the Washington Post. There's an article from September 21st, 2020 by Whitney Joyner that talked about the need to make psychedelics accessible to BIPOC. And they were interviewing Jamila George, who did a MAP study, but then they couldn't even get enough people of color to participate in it because their anxiety their anxiety about participating in a drug that might lead to incarceration. They were like, I'm not taking a drug that, no way, right? So there was just a lot of things that we need to think more deeply about in order to make things more accessible.
And it might be that somebody kind of going through this would like a male and female therapist. And I think that's a fine thing to be able to request and receive, but maybe not make it the default.
Yeah. Oh, does Tal?
Yeah.
want to say anything?
Yeah, and Tal, if you wanna go ahead and unmute and speak, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, I will read the next question. Oh, hold on, sorry.
And now, hi. Nice to meet everybody. I'm Tal Sharabi. I'm a psychotherapist and addiction counselor. Kind of new to Oregon, but licensed here as well. I'm currently in the program, and it's a legal program, so we can't say, they cannot expect us to do any illegal drugs. This is against the law, and we don't want to promote that. But when you think about people that are attracted to this, people that want to do this kind of work, usually it's people that have experience. Some people went abroad, they have experience going to Mexico, doing psilocybin journeys or ayahuasca. And some people doing underground work as well. So yeah, this is what I wanted just to clarify. Yeah.
Thanks, Tal.
Thank you.
I personally have a question, and it builds on what Ms. Sharabi said about how the CIIS program won't condone doing illegal drugs, but it's literally a psychedelic therapy program. My question to the two presenters is, when are these trainings and these models going to stop shooting themselves in the foot, and just be honest, and stop hiding behind that, what is it going to take?
Well, what do you think? I mean, decriminalization. Like, we need to have consciousness sovereignty as a matter of fact, but that's a pretty evolutionary thing. I mean, right now we can't even get people to stop shooting Black people. I mean, so I don't know how we're going to get there, but we're keep trying to move forward. What do you think, Chris?
I mean, I think we're trying to change the system from within. So until we are able to change the rules, we have to play by the rules. And I do also, to go along with what Tal said, I know that CIS, like part of you have to do like a experiential experience. A lot of people do like holotropic breath work, but I do know people who have gone through the program and have gone to Amsterdam because they were able to afford it and did psilocybin therapy there, or Jamaica, or one of these places where it is legal, which is it makes my mind do mental gymnastics, thinking that the only way to do this is to get on an airplane and fly halfway around the world. But hopefully that won't be the case for much longer.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to read another question from the chat box, if that's okay. So we have another question that is,
it helps
from Rick Allander. What training do you recommend which would likely help with the future 109 certification for practitioners?
I mean, I think
that, are we?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I don't think 2 years is a long time to figure it out. But thankfully, a lot of these programs have already started up. I don't know which is the best one, but I think we can learn from what's already happened. And a lot of these underground networks have amazing apprenticeship programs that are longer and much more involved than CIIS. So I would like it if something like that were to be the certification requirement, but I don't think it's going to be that rigorous, unfortunately. So I think whatever we do have, I'm hoping that the focus on ethics is kind of front and center. And I think the actual sort of sitting for people is pretty straightforward and simple. I think the more challenging part is the integration and you know, some of the interpersonal stuff that can come up around these treatments. So I'm sorry that I don't think that answered your question very well, but
No, but you know, Chris, you and I could talk about, we could create a training program together. I could do that with you. That'd be fun. And then this is what we've done forever in the underground. It
Yeah.
didn't exist. I wanted to have best practices. I wanted to be impeccable and focus on consent. I created those standards and protocols. So I used my academic training to create something, and then I made it available to other people. And if I live by that kind of integrity, that's all you can do, right? So we can create something, and then it'll be useful in the future sometime. You know, people will self-select what level of training and how they want to embody it.
What else do we have here?
Yeah, I can read the latest question from John and Alana. Members of the BIPOC community have a significant and core reasons for not getting involved in psychedelic therapy or psychological therapy at all. How can someone trust one's psychological health to someone, quote unquote, a white person, who has no experience of your daily life? Bridging that gap is important. Do you have suggestions?
Yeah, we need to give training for free to people of color. We need to leverage our own privilege and power and give it away to people that we've benefited from their culture, even if they're not in the present. You know, it's just like reparations of land. We actually need to set that standard and start doing that.
Yeah. And last year, MAPS held the first and so far only person of color therapist training in Kentucky. And I hope that there's more of that. Yeah, and I know that like the CIS program will give scholarships to people of color and other marginalized communities, and that's resulted in some great work. I mean, I know of stuff going up in the Bay Area that resulted from people of color going through the CIS training and starting a clinic specifically for minority stress and other people of color.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Another question from Peter G. There is some clear indication that psilocybin is effective in the palliation of the fear of dying. Are there other areas that may be transformed by the open use of psychedelics outside of psychological therapies?
What do you mean outside of psychological therapies?
I am also confused by the question.
Clarify that.
Peter?
Hi there. Thank you for such an excellent presentation. It's just really a wonderful fusion. By outside of psychological therapies, I'm trying to look outside of the realm of individuation, of personal growth, of treatment of depression, of treatment of psychological or psychiatric conditions. Clearly, you know, there are going to be uses and practicalities in the psychological therapeutic realm, but I'm looking at other realms of human experience that may be transformed by the entheogens. I just wondered if any occur to you.
You want to go first, Chris, and then I'll say something. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's kind of going back to that those different categories of the way that psychedelics have been used. There's, you know, research into psychedelics increasing creativity or, you know, expanding just the betterment of well people, I think is what Bob Jesse says. And if you go to his website, the Council on Spiritual Practices, he has a lot to say about this, about, you know, well people using psychedelics for other types of enhancement. And then I think also spiritual practices. And when we talk about the Catholic Church, I think that was when, you know, an organized group of people came in and said, you know, you can no longer have direct access to the divine. That's something that's reserved for a special few. And so I think psychedelics and spirituality is another very interesting topic, with people having direct access to the divine is an interesting thing.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I was going to point to. I mean, I'm primarily, the idea of it being therapeutic is an aside to me. And then primarily, my interest is in the hidden religions, which are all the heretical traditions of the Western path that became heretical during the burning times. And, the same conditions that were required for the demotion of women, the enslavement of people from Africa, and the plundering of the riches from this new world that we're living in, right? So all of that happened in a great turning of the wheel. And now I think we're at the other side of it, okay? So my main interest and my self-accepted direction is to move everyone who's willing towards evolutionary consciousness and towards the embodied experience that we are all one. That as many people as it is possible to give that experience to will cause us to move towards this midwifing of this new aeon thing that I keep saying. And the language is awkward. But once you've had the experience using psilocybin or 5-MeO DMT or whatever, or sex magic or breath work, or, these are all Zen meditation for years, darkness practice. These are all different paths to the same experience of unitary consciousness. Once we all get that, I think, well, it'll, that's my goal, right? So that's not a psychological, it's beyond psychology. It is psychological. Well, it's embedded in psychology, right? If you have the experience of yourself as God and you appreciate and understand and your immanence, which is what happens that causes people in 4th stage cancer, they have a psilocybin trip and they go, oh, I am not afraid of dying because it doesn't matter. I'm just going to change form. And the song of it is so, what I'm talking about. It's so fucking ecstatic. We could all be living in ecstatic states the majority of the time instead of suffering under this fucking fascist bullshit. And we need to move towards that. We have an obligation to move towards that. For non-humans, we have an obligation to move towards that. To honor our ancestors, to honor our blood lineage dead, we have an obligation to do that work. Sorry, I got onto it, didn't I?
Thank you.
It looks like there's a lot of questions about the cost, and it's not an inexpensive treatment given the amount of therapy hours. That being said, for phase 3, the average length of time that the people had PTSD, severe treatment-resistant PTSD, was over 20 years. And so imagine 20 years of daily medication, sometimes multiple daily medications, weekly therapy stretching on for years and years and years, hospitalizations, economic loss to not being able to work, medical illnesses from untreated PTSD also causing the healthcare system. So when you take into account all of those costs, I think it's a pretty cost-effective treatment. And a paper just came out, I think earlier this month or last month, about the cost effectiveness of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, and I think it was like three years and some months to sort of make up for the cost of the treatment. But that being said, I think the 2-therapist model is really important for lots of different reasons. But I don't think it's a vital thing to have really expensive therapists. And there was a study where it was a very practiced therapist and an intern. I think that's one model that's a little bit more sustainable. Clergy, peer support specialists. I think there are lots of people who we can call therapists who would do amazing work and maybe not cost people so much money.
In terms of it costing a lot of money, I'm just going to say, today I saw on the Double Blind website their free instruction PDF for how to grow mushrooms.
Right. That's another big one. Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be very expensive. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
You'd have to, I guess, not grow more than 7 grams. Is that the?
Yeah, you can only grow, enough to fit in a tiny like half-quart mason jar. That's all. That's it.
Okay. So I'm just kind of joking, but there you go.
Yeah. Awesome. I'm curious to ask both of you what you think about the group ceremony model, because that's the most common solution I hear to the complaint of. Yeah. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Cool. I just did. It's really helpful to do things in a group. And for me, my student May and I gave a presentation at the Guy and Mind Psychedelics Conference in July 2019. That was all about that. And there's a video that's on, what is Tom's website? On the Guy and Mind Conference YouTube. If you send me an email at livingloverevolution@me.com, I can send it to you. I'll make up a page and put it where all the links are. But anyway, we do advanced temples. So people study with me and have gone to 3 or 4 temples with me. Then they also get invited to do advanced temples is what we say. It's still the worship of Aphrodite, but we sprinkle entheogens in it, if that makes sense. So I like it because the field is larger, it's more resonant. And if you're doing it with the generation of oxytocin and serotonin, because you're touching each other, it's just exponentially beautiful. And you can send off in a toroid shape streams of energy and waves to heal. We dedicate the intention to people that are near death, to brand new babies being blessed. It's magic. So you also send energy to species that are becoming extinct. You can elevate your ancestors. There's all kinds of magical intentions. So when you have a big group of 15 to 25 people and you're doing it, it's beautiful.
And this is how these things have been used for, forever.
Centuries.
It's I think more of a challenge to take that and fit it into the medical research model, but it's not impossible. And actually, me and my colleagues did the first sort of modern, rigorous research design trial of psilocybin group therapy. We didn't do the psilocybin sessions in a group setting, but that was one of the pieces of feedback we got from the participants of why not. But it was one step toward that, and I am about to submit a protocol to the FDA for MDMA assisted group therapy for veterans with PTSD, where they'll have 2 MDMA sessions. One will be individual and the second one will be in a group. And then all of their prep and integration essentially will be done in a group. And for me, I think cost effectiveness and time effectiveness is a bonus, but it is not the primary benefit of doing these things in a group. I think there's something about the group that adds an element of, benefit that you don't get with.
Well, it's empowering. You experience yourself as immanent, and then you're resonant with that. You're full of that energy for weeks and months. It's like, ooh. Yeah. Oh, yes, Kazri, that's my email, and you can share it with everyone. That's fine. I have a website. Yeah. You can go to livingloverevolution.org or aphroditetemple.com. Those are open to the public. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to put those in the chat, and Chris, if you would like to represent anything and put it in the chat as well, just since we're closing up here. I'm also going to put the link to the Psychedelic Society link tree in the chat, and if you feel called to donate, As I said at the beginning of this presentation, we're a nonprofit organization, and all donations go to funding presentations like this. Our entire team is volunteer driven, and I cannot wait to have both of you back at the Portland Psychedelic Society so that we can learn even more about the fantastic work that you're doing in this field. So thank you both. So much, and thank you everyone for being here and for participating in the discussion. This was a blessing.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm gonna call you so we have an after.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Terry.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Chris, I'm gonna call you or text